you doing? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. When Hurricane Helene roared across Florida and up the East Coast in late September, relief efforts began immediately. People were without power, water, food, medical supplies, and a host of other basic needs. The Federal Emergency Management Agency exists for these kind of situations, but it's also when nonprofit organizations spring into action. From high-profile organizations such as the American Red Cross and the United Way to smaller local organizations, nonprofits play a huge role in the recovery effort. The work is difficult and expensive, and the physical and mental energy required quickly takes its toll on volunteers. Then, of course, just a couple weeks later, Hurricane Milton struck Florida, stacking disasters and impacting nonprofits that were already stretched by Helene. To find out the kind of impact these stacked disasters may have on nonprofit organizations helping with relief efforts and the challenges that will be faced not only in the present and the future, we're joined by Professor Beth Gazley, who is a world-renowned expert in U.S. nonprofit management and civil society policy. She's published more than 85 research articles, books, and commentary addressing intersectoral collaboration, volunteerism, nonprofit governance, public service co-production, association management, disaster response, and other topics. Beth, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Ken.
To start, just walk me through the way emergency managers deal with major disasters.
Emergency managers do have an organizational framework. They think about 4 activities: planning, mitigation, response, and recovery. And we tend to, at moments like this, when a hurricane has just roared through, we tend to be thinking about the response and recovery. But if you go to the Monroe County Emergency Management website, where Jamie Niebel, who, by the way, comes from a nonprofit background, our local emergency manager, leads our local efforts, Jamie's mostly thinking about planning and mitigation. So you'll find a lot in information there about fire risks in homes and how to protect your home. And you can't insure your way out of these kinds of hazards that we face on a day-to-day basis. So mitigation also is a really, really important part of the planning process. And what they want us to be thinking about all the time is that we need to be planning and we need to be mitigating our risks from severe weather or other kinds of disasters, not just responding and recovering.
Well, what are some of the challenges that charitable disaster or relief organizations face whenever there is a disaster?
Well, the first thing that's always going to happen is that they have to be asking about their own business continuity. So the first thing that may happen to a not-for-profit under kind of fairly normal circumstances, like the supercell that came through Monroe County in June, is they're looking around to make sure their building's good, their generators are running. We were without power for up to 4 or 5 days. And they're looking at whether, if they provide food, for instance, like a pantry, they're thinking about whether the food is safe. So they have all kinds of risk management plans in place for normal business operations under normal circumstances like a temporary power outage. What we're facing now is for people to have to think in a very different way about threats. So a hurricane of a Category 5 would come through Florida maybe once every 10 years, 10, 20 years ago. They're going to be happening every year. They will happen every year. We know that because the Gulf of Mexico has warmed up so much. And so all of a sudden, these are organizations that have had a very short time frame to be thinking at exponential level about how to harden their infrastructure, how to keep their staff safe, and how to still provide services to people.
Well, there's a cost involved with all of that as well, the planning. And the more disasters you have, the more expensive that becomes. That in and of itself seems like a real challenge for these organizations.
I think there's one bright light in all of this, and that is that people are really generous after disasters. After Russia invaded Ukraine, after Helene, I'm sure we're going to see it after Milton. People contribute a lot of money. The amount of contributions that came in after Hurricane Harvey in Texas in 2017 was substantially more than the Texas government allocated for disaster recovery. So that's not going to change. What tends to happen, though, is people give once. They give in the immediate. They give, for relief. I heard from any number of my friends. They'd made a one-time gift. And that creates a really unstable charitable budget over time, because these are charities like the Red Cross. If you go into their 990 forms and you look at them over many years, you notice that they've got actually an unstable budget from year to year, because one year there may have been major disasters that people responded to with generosity, and then maybe the next year there isn't. So the one thing I would say about the people who support charities this way is, if you think disaster response is important, it's part of your charitable, your own charitable giving ethos, do it every year and allow these organizations to build up a greater capacity so that they can do the kind of mitigation that they need to be doing as well to make sure that they've got service continuity and business continuity.
When it comes to the unpredictability of hurricanes, you said Category 5s had been a relatively rare situation. Here we had a Category 4. I know that Milton came on land at Category 3, but it also, built up very quickly in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was difficult to kind of judge exactly how strong this thing's going to be. What kind of challenges come with these kind of situations stacking so close to one another for relief efforts? Because again, now you're spread all over Florida, East Coast, West Coast. What kind of challenges it comes with trying to plan to deal with that kind of thing?
Well, I think there's kind of a good news, bad news kind of message in that as well. From the meteorologist's point of view, I would encourage everybody to pay really close attention to what they're seeing in the news that's coming from meteorologists, where you see words like unprecedented, unusual. The fact that there were more than 100 tornado warnings in Florida out of a single hurricane is unusual. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's unusual. And so, but people have to understand from a meteorologist's point of view, meteorologists are pretty conservative people. They're not going to say today this is the new normal, but there are a number of them who are thinking that we might even have to rethink the way we categorize hurricanes. So people don't say, oh, it's only a 3. I've had a 3. Debbie was a 3, right? Because 18 inches of rain dropping in the St. Pete area is a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event. And so there are unusual circumstances that put people at risk in this Category 3 or Category 4 hurricane. So that's one thing. And I really encourage people to pay attention to meteorologists, because they see climate change for what it is, and they don't politicize the issue. There's good news in this, though, and that is, I think that people are the research on the way people respond to risks tells us that people will rethink their risks, and they will become more careful and conservative and more safety conscious when they have direct experience with a natural disaster. So in recent years, we're getting to the point where in any current year, more than half of the U.S. population could be exposed. I think we're close to that happening. Could be exposed to a natural disaster of one kind or another. If you conclude everything from wildfires to great heat events like we've been having in the American Southwest this summer, to the hurricanes and storms that we've had on the East Coast. Even in the Midwest, which everybody always thinks the Midwest is safe, but then we have supercells and derechos in the Midwest. So those are people who now are thinking about risk differently because they've had direct experience with it, and that's a good thing. That's what people should be responding to. What concerns me, and this happened to, first thing I did this morning, as soon as I knew she was out of bed, is I texted a very good friend of mine in Daytona Beach, "Are you okay?" Because I had called her 2 days ago and gently asked her to revisit her understanding of flood risk, and she said, "Oh, it only comes up halfway up the street." And I was thinking, well, maybe last time with Debbie it did, but how about this time? She's okay. I checked on her. She's just fine. But that is a very, very typical response from people. They say, well, Michael was fine. Debbie was fine. I wasn't in the cone. People who were outside the hurricane cone got hurt by tornadoes in this storm. So people have to be thinking, I think, very differently about their risk exposure.
And how do nonprofits then have to look at this differently? Because as the number of these disasters increase, it certainly changes the approach that has historically maybe been from these organizations.
So the research I'm in the middle of right now is asking nonprofits kind of a two-headed question. Are you planning for disasters, and are you planning for disasters in the context of climate change? And the answer to the first question is generally yes. Most organizations out there have emergency evacuation plans. They have the normal kinds of things you would expect any kind of business, any kind of small enterprise to have. Training in food safety, training in emergency response, those sort of things, active shooters plans. What they're not doing is thinking about this exponential increase in risks that we're seeing. So they're not having board-level conversations about climate change as a strategic imperative. Emergency response and emergency planning is an operational issue for most organizations. And so we're really seeing sort of a, it's the staff are concerned, and the staff may be very safety conscious, but they're not necessarily feeling like they're in a position, because of the politicized nature of climate change, they're not thinking they're in a position to bring this up to a key stakeholder level. And that's a concern, because then these are boards that are really only thinking ahead to the next disaster. They're not thinking that we might be in a cycle where we're getting a hurricane every 2 weeks.
I'm going to ask you a question that I don't know that you could answer. How do you overcome that?
I think what we're hearing, and one of our questions, because we went to essentially what we consider to be the most safety conscious organizations, the high performers. So it's a kind of a research you do where you go to the best practices people and say, what can you teach everybody else? And what we're hearing from them is that they want the funding. They want the political backup. They want policy support from state capital for redundancy building, which is another principle of emergency management, is build in redundancies. The power goes out, you have a generator. The generator goes out, you have another generator. And that's where their minds are going right now. These are the most sort of safety forward organizations. The other thing they're saying is that there's a lot to learn from one another. And so, this is, generally speaking, not every organization, but generally speaking, an under-resourced area of the economic sector, nonprofits. But they're good networkers. And so if they're operating within service networks where they're learning from each other, helping each other with plans and good apps to use and safety training, and this insurance agent knows what they're doing, and go talk to the fire marshal about that, then that certainly makes them more efficient in what they're able to accomplish.
Every one of these events, obviously there's a recovery time even for the organization in terms of resource drain, in terms of, again, physical and mental energy drain for the volunteers that are involved. What is the general timeline in say, I don't know, I know that there's not a normal disaster. That's not a category of things, but what is that kind of normal recovery time when you have one of these relief organizations have to jump into action? Do you know just the regular recovery time and how planning might have to change to overcome that?
Yeah, well, actually, Ken, we don't know the answer to that question. We don't know. There hasn't been enough attention paid to how much the social safety net frays after a disaster. Look at, there's, I got to tell you, from a personal point of view as a researcher, there's nothing I would like more right now to do than to be calling every charity in Western North Carolina and asking them what percent of your services were disrupted? What's your greatest need right now? What do you wish you'd known 2 weeks ago that you don't know then? But I'm not going to bother them.
Sure.
Right? They are all hanging on by the skin of their teeth right now. And so it's hard for researchers to get this kind of information, but I also think it's an area where we need to pay just a lot more attention as researchers. So we have an understanding how much does the social safety net fray.
And the challenge to that is at some point you can reach out to them, but maybe in the middle of that, something else is going to happen and they have to deal with and start all over again. So any kind of consistent study seems like it'd be difficult.
Well, I'm doing right now, like everybody else is. I sit on our local United Way board. And so the first thing I did was set up a GoFundMe to support the Asheville United Way. And so we'll send them a nice friendly check from another United Way chapter, but I'm not going to bother them with research questions right now. So what we do, there are people out there. I have a colleague, for instance, a collaborator who's looked at the hospitals in the St. Pete, Tampa area, looked at the floodplains that they inhabit, and tried to get a sense of whether they feel that they are at risk. And of course, a hospital, I think, is a great example of an organization that needs an enormous amount of recovery time after a disaster. They're not going to bounce back, right? But there's a principle also here that I want to mention, the principle of resiliency. So if you think about resiliency as just bouncing back to where you were before, Disaster planners don't think that way anymore, and they really think about bouncing forward, about making that organization or that facility more resistant, more weather hardy than it was before. The Tampa General Hospital is a great example. This is a hospital that was built just a handful of years after a major hurricane went through Florida, I believe in about 1920. But they built it on an island in the middle of the bay. So they didn't think about that single hurricane as a risk. So now they have to come up with things like aqua fences to protect that hospital. And when the 13-foot height of this aqua fence no longer can withstand the storm surge of a storm, there were just a few feet they had of wiggle room, then they're going to have to build a higher aqua fence. So even large institutions like that that have done some level of infrastructure development, they've moved their utilities facilities uphill 33 feet above sea level just to be more resilient. They may not have all the information and all the experience they need to really think about whether it's sustainable to put a hospital in an island in the middle of a bay.
Well, that resiliency aspect, is that the most critical when it comes to kind of planning forward for increasing impacts of weather events in terms of frequency, intensity, all of those kind of things? Is that just bounce back? Is that the most important part of this?
Well, the bounce forward principle in resiliency is pretty central. There are other principles that they think about. There's a term that's really not politically friendly right now. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's the idea of planned retreat. So I would argue that's a kind of resiliency. When you say, it just doesn't make sense to live in a community where my house is 1 foot above the flood of the water table, and if it floods, my house is going to flood. So I heard from a student in my class this morning. I was asking my students how their families were. And a student said, yeah, my parents were in Orlando, and the flood did not come from outside the house. It came from under the house.
Okay.
And their house got flooded. Yeah, they're okay, but they've got some damage now they're going to have to deal with. And so, resiliency is also about an attitude. It's also about thinking differently about where we live, about what our infrastructure looks like. One of the big complaints about disaster response is that it looks a lot more politically feasible to be sending in the troops in the white trucks that are going to fix your utilities than it is rebuilding bridges ahead of disasters.
Right.
And, strengthening the infrastructure ahead of that's expensive, and it's not as politically easy to accomplish.
And there's going to be people that argue that we don't need something this big. We don't need it to be that strong, something an aqua fence to be that high because it costs X number of dollars.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So everybody's thinking about bridges. I've had even colleagues say to me in past years, oh, well, what does a mountain area need to worry about flooding? They've got higher ground to go to. And you always then, I think everybody has come to a great realization pretty quickly that if you live in mountainous areas, you probably live around bridges, and bridges wash out. So there has been, with a number of the federal programs, the infrastructure programs, the Build Back Better program and other programs, there actually has been a much, much greater emphasis in this country on bridge rehab and bridge strengthening because our bridge infrastructure is so old. Bridges are built to last 100 years. 100 years ago, we were not thinking about climate change.
Right. Well, yeah, you can go up that mountain, but you got to come back down. And that's the challenge. Well, the suffering involved with these disasters is incredible, and I know our best wishes go out to the communities and the responders that have been working on this. And I just thank you so much for your insight on this from an organizational standpoint, because it feels like that's something that sometimes is overlooked after the event actually happens. The world moves on, and these areas and these volunteers can't. So I thank you so much for coming on and talking about this.
Thank you as well. And last thing I want to say here is don't politicize FEMA and don't politicize FEMA aid, because people are suffering out there and they need accurate information so that they can go and get aid.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Vykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.